Okay, in chapter 9, we're talking about the social, emotional, and spiritual development of ages 3 to 6. And did all of you see my little discussion page on Canvas where I said that little handout I gave you the other day? I don't have one here with me, but it's uploaded to Canvas, that suggestions to parents on teaching their children how to read. I suggested that you email one to somebody or give a copy of it to someone, and just to see what kind of reaction you get. Say, hey, I just thought you'd like to know how you can enrich your child's life before they head off to school and help them be more successful in school. Well, page 291 and 292 on chapter 9 talk about self-regulation. And how does the author describe self-regulation? The ability to control your behavior, your emotions, your thoughts. So how did you learn to control your behavior? You just woke up one day and said, I'm going to behave. I'm going to be an obedient person. I'm going to do what I'm told to do, even before I'm told to do it. Did anyone here just wake up one day and decide that was the way to live and have been living that way ever since? How did you learn to get up and get ready for school on time when you were younger? Or how did you learn to get up and get ready to go anywhere? Did all of you have an alarm clock at home where you set an alarm clock? Or did your parents wake you up? Whose parents woke them up? Your parents didn't give you an alarm clock and say, it's time for you to be responsible. You're 4 years old. It's time to set an alarm clock. Did they ever do that? Or did they just keep treating you like a 4-year-old until you went off to college? No, tell me my parents didn't do that to me. Yes, they did. They just let me sleep in. I just slept in until they came in and said, you have to get up. And my mom would say, boys, it's time to get up. And it just didn't faze me. And as soon as my dad came in the house and I heard my mom say, I told those boys to get up 3 times and they're still in bed. And I heard this. After 3 steps, I was out of bed, had my jeans on, ready to go to work. What's that all about? That's self-regulation. Why would I just ignore my mom and then all of a sudden get cracking when my dad's footsteps are coming through the house? Because he's not going to come in and say, boys, it's time to get up and get to work. He's going to not be a happy camper. And if I have to work for him all day long and he's not a happy camper, the work's going to go a lot harder than if I would have just been a little more cooperative. So I'm thinking, for the sake of a better day later on, I'm going to get up and get out of here and get dressed and get ready to go. What about your emotions? Did any of you have do you recall when you were younger having emotional outbursts? Anyone recall having those? Anyone recall ever throwing a tantrum? Did it work? You saw a friend throw a tantrum and get what they want, so you tried it. Did it work? No, because my parents just didn't allow that kind of thing. Do any of you remember crying about something that just was so devastating? You might not even remember what it was. You just remember sobbing and going on, and your parents say, now, settle down, take a deep breath. Did any of you have parents who did that to you? Or did it happen so early in life that you just don't remember it? And you learn to control your behavior. You learn to control your emotions. When you sit down at the table, do you just grab food with your fingers and eat it, or do you pick up your silverware? Have you been to any part of the world where they don't have silverware? They all just use their fingers to eat food? I'm thinking if I ever go to one of those countries, guess what I'm packing in my suitcase? A spoon, so I can dip my food out. You go, well, it might offend somebody. I'm going, oh, please don't tell me that. Well, if it would offend them, then I'll put my spoon away and I'll get a little slice of bread and soak up whatever's in there and dip it up and eat it like they are. But that just, why? Because I was taught to use silverware when I sit down at the table to eat. Were all of you taught to use silverware? Do you remember learning to use a spoon and a fork and a knife to try to cut things? Or did your parents always cut it up for you? Then all you had to learn to do was use a spoon and a fork. So, what about your thought regulation? Regulating your thoughts. How many have little brothers or sisters? How many were little brothers or sisters? Okay, those of you who were younger, did you have older brothers and sisters that wanted something you had and they just took it away from you? And what did you do when that happened?
Told Mom.
That's exactly right, Micah. That's exactly right. You go to the people in charge and you say, they did something wrong, they took my stuff, and they know when you tell Mom they're going to be in trouble. Because that's not appropriate. They wanted what you had and they just took it. No, that's inappropriate behavior. That's inappropriate thinking. And you can tell on them when they're older and get them in trouble. Did any of you have younger siblings who wanted what you had and they tried to take it away from you? Did you tell Mom? Or did you just thump on them? Did you little ones ever try to younger ones try to take something away from the older ones? I could see a guy taking something away from his. Do you have older sisters? Mm-hmm. So you could just kind of push her around once in a while? And when you did, what did she do, Logan? Did she tell Mom?
Yep.
And what happened?
I'd probably get in trouble.
And you got in trouble. I mean, that's just part of it. We basically learned to regulate our behavior, our emotions, our thoughts, our actions, because the adults around us and others helped us learn that. And where we didn't do it, someone would tell on us, and we would eventually learn how to handle some of this stuff. Self-regulation, it says on page 291 and 292, requires several skills. One is being aware of what's expected of you. Being aware of the expectations. Did any of you ever sit down at a table and start eating and then someone asked you a question and you would answer the question while you were still chewing your food? Did anyone here ever do that? And what did your parents say to you?
Don't eat with your mouth full. Or don't talk with your mouth full.
Don't talk with your mouth full.
Don't eat with your mouth full.
Don't talk with your mouth full of food. So can I talk if there's a little bit of food in my mouth? No. Chew up the food, swallow the food. Were any of you taught how many times to chew food before you swallow it? None of you had anyone teach you the proper number of times to chew food so it would get enough saliva in it to make for healthy digestion when you swallowed it? You didn't study that in health class or anywhere in life? Well, Google it sometime and see how many times should you chew food before you swallow it. It'll wear you out. If I chewed my Cheerios in the morning as many times as it says to before I swallowed it, I'm thinking I it would all be gone before I could chew it that many times. But the point is that we eat too fast in this society, and we probably need to slow down a little bit. But you know, when I was growing up, I don't ever remember somebody saying, don't talk with food in your mouth. If I'm eating and someone asked me a question, it was okay at my house to answer the question. I didn't realize you weren't supposed to talk with food in your mouth till I came to Calvary as a student, and in the cafeteria, somebody brought it to my attention that you're not supposed to talk with food in your mouth. I'm going, you're not? And it's like, so where did you grow up? And then when I said on a farm in Oklahoma, they go, oh, well, okay, I understand now. Farmers in Oklahoma. No, I know some farmers in Oklahoma who were taught not to talk with food in their mouth. Somehow that just didn't come up at our house. So I had to wait till I learned that later in life. There used to be a lady that came to school like one day a week, and she would come into the cafeteria and give us instructions on the proper way to handle utensils, the proper way to eat. Were any of you taught that you take your fork and you put it in the meat and you cut it with a knife, and then you put the knife down, and then you put the fork in the other hand, and then you take the food and put it in your mouth? Were you taught that? Were any of you taught that? How were you taught to do it, Logan? You put your fork in it, you cut it, and then you take your left hand and put it in your mouth?
Yeah, basically.
Now see, that's the European way of doing things. And I think the Europeans are so smart. Why would we do all that monkeying around, changing hands, laying things down? Because it's, who was that lady who came up with all those rules for table manners? All I know is she was quoted a lot when I was a student here, and we were all told we need to learn how to eat properly at the table, to have good manners. Oh, so I worked at it. Probably spent most of my life reverting back to the way I grew up than the way I was taught as an adult. That's why the earlier you teach some of this stuff, the better off it is. But we need to be aware of what's expected of us. The second thing is, it says, we need to monitor our behavior. We need to be asking ourselves, how am I doing? Am I chewing my food enough? Am I swallowing all of my food before I answer a question? Am I brushing my teeth each morning? Am I doing all these things? It's just like you start thinking about how am I doing in my behavior? How am I doing in my thinking? How am I doing in my emotions? And then the third thing the book says is an awareness of your success. Now, this is an area where I think that probably caregivers and teachers and adults in the world don't spend enough time commending little children for being successful at some of the skills that we want them to learn in terms of their behaviors, their monitoring and handling their emotions, and their thought processes. Some articles have been written about catching kids doing the right thing and commend them for it. And I think we don't do enough of that for some reason. I don't know why. We just don't seem to do enough of that, commending children for being successful. And I'm convinced that the more you tell a child that they are being successful, the more they start to monitor their own success and become aware of it themselves and develop the ability to be aware in their own heart and mind that they're being successful. It doesn't have to always come externally, but I think a lot of times, because it hasn't been given by other people, a lot of people just don't develop the sense of awareness of their success. Have you ever done something well and someone said, you did a good job when you did thus and so. And in your heart you go, I know. You were aware of your success? We usually don't say, I know. What we say is, well, thank you very much. But if you've developed the ability to be aware of your success, you've come a long way in the maturation process. And there's a lot of people who, even as young adults and as older adults, aren't there yet. Self-regulation. This is how important self-regulation is in helping children learn it. It correlates with academic performance. The better you are at self-regulation, the better you'll be in terms of your academic performance in school. It correlates with problem solving. The better you are at self-regulating, the better you'll be at problem solving. It even relates to reading comprehension. The better you are at self-regulation, the better you'll be at reading comprehension. It even correlates with peer relations. The better you are at self-regulation, the better relationships you'll have with your peers. Well, that kind of makes sense too, doesn't it? If you've learned to listen to what others have to say, instead of just going around telling everybody what you think about everything, you have more friends. And if you always walk in the room and say, you know what I think about this? And you can see people looking and going, well, we know you have thoughts about everything because you're always sharing them, but the truth is nobody's really interested in listening. See how that can damage peer relationships, where you say, you know, I just have to learn to listen to what other people have to say and control my inclination to want to spill my thoughts all the time and tell everybody what's on my mind and how I feel and what I think about it. It's like, no, let's focus on others and say, what do you think about it? How do you feel about it? What's on your mind? So self-regulation also correlates with motivation, how motivated you are. The more skillful you are at regulating yourself, and the more skillful we make children at regulating themselves, the more they're motivated to do things in life. And the higher sense of self-worth, the textbook calls it. Now, it uses the word self-worth, but some books will talk about sense of esteem, but I just like the word, your sense of worth. Because really, most of your sense of worth, most of a child's sense of worth comes from what other people say about them and what other people say to them. So it becomes kind of my responsibility to take this little 3 to 6 year old and help them develop a sense of worth by me talking about all the things they're good at in front of them where they can hear it, and telling other people that, as well as telling them how good they are at something. Just commending them for what they're doing. And if I commend them for being good at self-regulation, then what's happening is I'm building up their sense of worth. Their perceived competence, the better you are at self-regulation, the more you will perceive yourself as competent, capable of doing things. The more powerful you feel, and the more moral you become. Self-regulation promotes morality. How is that? Well, if I'm learning to regulate my behavior to be pleasing to those in authority over me, and my emotions so I don't just have these outbursts, and my thoughts so I don't say, if I think it, say it. Were any of you taught this little proverb? If you can't say something nice about another person, what?
Don't say anything at all.
Don't say anything at all. Just keep it to yourself. Keep your ugly thoughts to yourself. And can you see what happens? The more I begin to regulate myself in that regard, the more of a moral person I become. I become a person who's practicing more, who's thinking moral thoughts more often thinking, no, you shouldn't say that, that's not kind. But also behaving in a moral fashion, having moral conduct. And all of that is related to helping children learn to regulate themselves, to just take control of their lives and control their behavior, their emotions, and their thoughts. On page 292, it talks about how adults try to direct children's behavior and emotions, and it talks about how effective they are. Let's see. My mom suggested that it was time to get up because we had chores to do, and I just laid there in bed. My mom says, I've told the boys 3 times to get up and they're still in bed. And I hear this thump, thump, thump coming through the house, and bingo, I'm on my feet, got my jeans on, tying my shoes, and I'm ready to head out the door to the bedroom before he even gets there to look inside. What's going on? Well, my mom was making suggestions, trying to be persuasive, reasoning with me, and my dad was just using power. Now, which would you prefer that people use with you? Persuasion and reason, or power?
Reason.
I like reason. I like persuasion. Convince me why it's a good idea. But if you take a little child and say, now, I'm telling you, if you run out in the street to pick up that ball that just rolled past you, you will go in the house and you won't play outside anymore. That's power. Now, do you understand why it would be dangerous to run out in the street to get your ball? You could get hit by a car. And wouldn't you know, he's out there and the ball runs out in the street and he runs out to get it and he didn't get hit by a car. Why? There was no car coming. Now, what's he likely to conclude from that? That there's never a car coming. And how many cars does it take to run over him when he runs out in the street to get a ball? Just one. So see, I'm going to use power with him to drive the point home, because using reason and persuasion is just too dangerous. But for some reason, some of the books that talk about helping children develop socially and emotionally and morally and spiritually, they seem to shy away from using this power thing. And I don't really know why. Because someday you're going to have the power and you're going to become a powerful enough person to where you can help a child become the kind of person that they ought to be. So why not? You're not using the power just to exercise the power. You're using the power to benefit the quality of their life. You follow what I'm talking about? Maybe that's why some people don't like power, because they see too many people abusing power. But just because it's abused by some people, it doesn't mean we should throw it out altogether. We just need to use it in a way that is not just feeding our egos, but rather it's being used for the benefit of the children that we're using the power with. And I added one here to this power, persuasion, and reason. Were any of you given scripture verses? Were any of you given scripture verses to help motivate you to do the right thing? What were some of the Bible verses you were given to motivate you to do the right thing? You remember any of them that were given to you by your parents or your caregivers?
My mom would always, it's a principle. But she would always say, listen and obey and you'll have a great day.
Listen and obey, and you'll have a great day.
Yeah.
And that to me is her paraphrase of Ephesians 6:1 and 2. And it was true, wasn't it? If you'd listen and obey, you'd have a better day than if you didn't listen and didn't obey. Sometimes I can see just on Micah's face, sometimes he decided to disobey because he thought he could get away with it.
No.
And what happened when you tried that? You got caught. Right?
Sometimes.
More often than not. Is that a hand back there, or are you just stretching? That did some of you find that you seem to get caught more often than your friends did? That you had friends who would do things and get away with it, and you would try it and you'd get caught? Our daughters said to us, "Dad, why is that?" I said, "Oh, that's an easy one. You're special. You're special. God has a special plan for your life, and He wants me to know about this stuff so I can help you become all the person that God wants you to be." Any other scriptures or paraphrase of scriptures that you were given? What?
Do to others as you would have them do to you.
Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And some people call that the golden rule. But it's right there in the Bible. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Anybody else have some verses of scripture that were given to you?
Love and forgive others as Jesus loved and forgave us.
Forgive others as Jesus forgives us, as He loves and forgives us. So you love and forgive other people. Anybody have any others?
Do nothing of selfish ambition or vain conceit.
Do nothing through selfish ambition or conceit.
My mom did another one with me. She was, be careful who you hang out with.
Be careful who you hang out with. From Proverbs, bad company does what? Corrupts good morals. Do you understand how much of the Bible just makes for a better life for us? And I believe I've put on Canvas, under the discussion page for chapter 9, I've put a question: how did you learn to be a moral person? And some of the stuff you're sharing with me in class, go to Canvas and put that up there. And if you haven't mentioned something in class, then go to Canvas and post something, because sometimes the people online can't hear what you say in class, so that gives them a chance to see it. And then the people online can post things, and you can look at what they have to say, and it lets the people online kind of participate in some of our discussions. So be sure and go to Canvas under that discussion page and add something about how you learn to be a moral person. The one that I posted up there was my grandparents had the 10 Commandments on the wall in their house, and all of the grade school classrooms I attended had the 10 Commandments on the wall, and people kept pointing to them whenever you were violating one of them. Or even if something in the community had happened and somebody at school was talking about it, they would say, "And what does the Bible say about that?" And they would point to the 10 Commandments. Did any of you go to school where they had the 10 Commandments on the wall in the classroom? Did you, Lydia?
Probably, I don't know. Because it was a Christian school, so I'm guessing.
It was a Christian school, so it must have been somewhere.
Yeah.
Why would public schools in America decide it was a bad idea to have the 10 Commandments on the wall? Which of those commandments is a bad idea? Oh, it's not the commandments that's a bad idea. Why did they decide to take them off the wall?
It's who it's from.
Because
It's
it
who
was...
It's who the commands are from, I think.
The commands are from the Bible,
Yeah.
and we don't want to be shoving the Bible down anybody's throat. I'm thinking that the world would be a better place if we had some of the Bible content, so to speak, shoved down our throat, in the sense that we listen to it, we hear it, we swallow it, we digest it, and begin to put it into practice. But for some reason, it's like, well, you just can't let a religion dominate society. Well, it's not the religion that's dominating the society. It's these 10 Commandments that this religion embraces. And these 10 Commandments are worth embracing. I was just watching a travel show recently on television, and the guy on the travel show was talking about the virtues of Buddhism. And he likes to travel through Buddhist countries and then go to their temples and talk about the tenets of Buddhism and how powerful it is and how it improves the quality of society. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, I've read those, I've looked at them, but they don't even come close to being as powerful as the Ten Commandments. And I suppose too, since we live in a society today that says, don't quote the Bible to me, then what Michael will do is quote his mom and her paraphrase of the Bible without telling people where it came from. In fact, this is interesting, isn't it? At the university, when I did my dissertation for my PhD, I was actually given instructions that said, you are not allowed to quote the Bible in your dissertation because the Bible is not an academic book. You can only quote books that are published and in the library. So if I wanted to say something that was in the Bible, what did I have to do? I couldn't just quote the Bible, so I had to go to the library and find somebody who quoted the Bible and then do what? Quote that person. And one guy pointed out to me how I had a sneaky way of getting around the rules. And I'm going, well, you know, sometimes if it's a bad rule, you just need to figure out how to circumvent it without breaking it. And I wasn't breaking the rule, and he agreed. He agreed that the information that I was presenting was worthwhile information. But he said, and then he said this, and he said, and it's amazing how many people quote the Bible. You wouldn't, he said, I don't even think some of them are Christians. And I said, I think you're right. I think there's a lot of people who have gone to the Bible and found useful information and just shared it for the betterment of humanity without regard as to where it comes from. But it makes sense, doesn't it, to you, that it makes sense to me anyway, that the God of the universe who created us and then gave us some instructions on how to live, his instructions would make for a better life, a happier life, if we would just follow those instructions. So don't be afraid to paraphrase scripture and just suggest things. And if your parents taught it to you, you can even say, you know, my parents used to teach me some of these rules, and some of us had more of that than others, and where you had that input from people to help you become a moral person. Mention some of it on Canvas under that discussion page on how you learn to be a moral person. Page 294 talks about gender development. I think it's worth looking at that page for a minute, because when you look at table 9.1 and you read what this says about gender development, it's pretty obvious that this is going from ages 2 through age 7. But it's pretty obvious by the time a little child gets to school, most little kids just naturally and normally develop the gender identity that they were born with. That's just normal. That's not being imposed on them by somebody. That's just the way they grow and develop. And I think it's a shame that somehow people have taken what appears to be an obvious, natural kind of growth and development thing and make it out as some contrived thing that somebody's trying to force on society. What's really going on is the people who don't like this natural kind of development are trying to impose their contrived notions on society and make the rest of us think that what's natural is not healthy and what's unnatural is healthy. And that shouldn't surprise anybody who's read Romans chapter 1, should it? Because it talks about how people on this earth who reject God and who reject what God has to say will call the truth a lie, and they'll call a lie the truth, and they'll turn things around and get it upside down. Page 296 talks about morality involves knowing the difference between what is right and what is wrong and acting on that knowledge. How were you taught what is right and what is wrong? Did I tell you what my mother did the first time I went to the grocery store and stole something? Did I tell you about that? I'm sitting in the car chewing on this piece of bubble gum that I picked up in a grocery store. And my sister says, "Where'd you get the bubble gum, Tommy?" And before I could answer, I was from the back seat in the front seat with my mom holding my shirt and holding me right up to her face and going, "Did you steal that bubble gum?" And I'm going, I saw some other kids take some, so I thought it was free. I was trying to make a reasonable case for free samples if you only take one piece. She goes, "You know better than that." And she opens the door of the car, pulls me outside. She's dragging me into the store. And that was back when stores had a counter with a little hole where you pass money through and things. And she takes me up there and she jams me up against that shelf, and my throat's on the shelf, and I'm thinking, I'm going to die right here. I can't breathe. And she goes, "This boy just stole this bubble gum that he's chewing on, and here's the wrapper. And he's spitting the gum out, but I'm going to pay for it." And the guy goes, "That's okay," and because my mom was going ballistic, and she's leaning on me. "It is not okay," and I'm going, "Agree with her, or I'm going to die." And he said, "Okay, lady, I'll take the money." And she paid. She drags me back out to the car. She puts me over the seat in the back. She goes, "Don't you ever do that again." Anyone get traumatized like that for stealing a stick of bubble gum? Well, I'm telling you, I was traumatized. I was so traumatized by my mom's hatred of stealing that when I became a teenager and you had to buy gasoline to drive your car, and all of my friends would go, when they were out of money, they would take a gas can and go out to a farmer's field and collect some midnight ethyl. Anyone know what that is? That's a little hose and a can siphoning gas out of a farmer's tractor to put in their car so they could run around town and not have to spend their own money for gas. And when my friends would be doing that, I'd say, "No, I don't think so." And they'd go, "Pluck, pluck, 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 pluck." What were they saying? "Chicken." And I'm going, I almost died when I was like 5 years old for stealing bubble gum. Can you imagine the visions in my traumatized head if I were to steal 5 gallons of gas from a farmer's tractor? I could just see the farmer hearing me out there, coming out with a shotgun and blowing my head off. I could just see the gasoline igniting and burning me up. You go, "You really were traumatized by that." Yes, I was. Was that a good trauma or a bad trauma? I say it was a good trauma because it kept me from becoming a thief and going to jail, like some of my friends did. Because they got away with stealing gasoline, then they started stealing something else, and eventually they decided that stealing was less work than working, but they eventually got caught. So I'm thinking that a little bit of trauma doesn't hurt when it comes to moral development. Did any of you ever tell a lie and your parents washed your mouth out with soap?
We did a spoonful of vinegar.
Was that disgusting to taste that soap? I'm thinking that was a good kind of trauma. It makes a lasting impression on some of the moral codes that we shouldn't violate. And then here again, if I had one of some of the people that I've read their books and listened to what they had to say, they'd say, "Oh, Tom, don't do that to these people. Let them know that there are no moral absolutes that are so important that people need to be traumatized to follow them. Everything's relative." And I kind of want to look at that person and say, so your existence on this earth could be worth something or it could be worth nothing. Agreed? It's all relative. And you taking up space and breathing air that the rest of us could use and make better use of is kind of a waste of air and space. Does anyone see where I'm going with this? It's just about time for us to vote whether or not, what was the old Roman thing in the amphitheater? Thumbs up or thumbs down? It's going, wait a minute. I'm going, hey, it's all relative, isn't it? See, even the people who preach there are no absolutes, when it comes to their own well-being, do they want other people to embrace some moral absolutes that would protect them from harm from others? Yes, they do. And I don't understand why they just don't say, oh, yes, I do. I understand why they don't just accept moral absolutes, because if you accept the moral absolute, like we've been talking about, the Ten Commandments, then you have to ask where'd they come from. And once you find out who gave them to us, then you want to learn more about him, and all of a sudden you have a great deal of responsibility toward your Creator. Morality involves knowing the difference between what's right and what's wrong and acting on that knowledge. And then it says on page 296, feelings of guilt reflect the development of the child's conscience. Now, I have something to read to you about the conscience. And I have to tell you that my wife and I didn't grow up in Christian homes. Okay, so we have these two little girls that come to live at our house. And I decided early on, when they were in this 3 to 6 year old range, that I would check to see what kind of morality they brought with them into the world. And I would just ask questions sometimes about would that be right or wrong. And they had a conscience. Do you remember ever violating your conscience when you were younger? Okay, do you ever remember feeling really guilty or bad about something you did? That was your conscience messing with you. And listen to what Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15 says. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves. In other words, some of the laws that God has given in His Word, those same laws are revealed in nature. For example, the commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. It's just natural for a man to say, if this is my wife, everybody else should leave her alone. You follow that? That's a natural kind of thing. The people who promote other kinds of lifestyles are promoting an unnatural lifestyle. So it says, by nature, they do what the law requires. They are a law to themselves, even though they don't have the law, because they have the law of nature and their own conscience. And let's go on and keep reading. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness. So they've already got a certain amount of knowledge of God in their hearts, and they also have a conscience that bears witness. And then this and this. that also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts either accuse or excuse themselves. And so here's what happens. God sends us into the world with a conscience and with a certain innate knowledge of who He is and what He expects of us, and then we either conform to those expectations or we talk ourselves out of it as if it doesn't matter and we don't have to live that way. So my thought was, take these little children and ask them questions. It's almost like I was inquiring into how fully developed is their conscience, and what kind of things do they have a conscience about. Now, I will tell you, I was surprised to see how even little 3 to 6 year olds could rationalize this stuff, because it would be wrong for someone to do something to them, but if they did the same thing to somebody else, there might be a good reason to do it. I'm going, wait a minute, let's talk about that. And that's that kind of egocentrism that the textbook talks about in this chapter. But I think it's important for us to say, hey, there is a conscience, and if you've spent years, since I didn't get saved till I was 18, if you've spent years hardening your conscience, then probably once you get saved, I know in my case, when I got saved and came to Calvary and started learning all this stuff in the Bible, it was like I was peeling the calluses off of my conscience. What Romans talks about, renewing our minds. Just simply making myself more sensitive to the things of God. Even to the point to where I got to the place to where people would make jokes back when I was a college student, and sometimes they made jokes about God, and jokes about Jesus, and jokes about the prophets. And I remember thinking one time, so, God, is that joke about your son, does that make you laugh, or does that make you sad, or does that offend you? And I got to the place to where I had peeled off enough of the callus that I was developing a sensitivity to the heart of God and how God felt about things. It wasn't, well, this is what God says about how you ought to live, but it's like, well, how does God feel about it? What does God think about it? And how sensitive am I to my relationship to my Heavenly Father? And I think we ought to do all we can to teach little kids to nurture their conscience in terms of the Bible, and where we see their conscience reflecting what the Bible says, we ought to say, you know, that's just like in the Bible over here, and tell them that's why we ought to be reading through the Bible on a regular basis, so we become familiar with this stuff, that we can talk to these little kids about it and help them become the kind of moral people that God wants us all to become. Page 296 presents a common moral dilemma used with children. And I don't know why this has persisted over all these years, but it sure has. Page 296. And what's it all about? It's at the top of page 296. Pretend for a moment that someone dear to you is very sick and will soon die if they do not receive treatment. There's a new drug available that might help, but the pharmacist who developed it is asking a very high price, much more than it cost him to develop the drug. Those high-priced pharmaceutical companies gouging people. You can't afford the price, and the druggist will not agree to sell it more cheaply or to let you pay for it later. So you become desperate and consider stealing the drug. Should you? Why or why not? Now, why should you not steal the drug? Since I was raised with the Ten Commandments on the wall in the school and the church and my home, or my grandparents' home, what would I say? Because the Bible says, thou shalt not steal. Well, I guess you'll just have to let your loved one die. Well, is there any other option out there? Is there anything else? Is my only option steal it or they die? Today, you could go on the internet and go to GoFundMe, right? And plead your case, and what would probably happen? Enough money would come in to pay for the medication. Are we all familiar with GoFundMe? I mean, how come that's not presented as one of the options? And the idea is that they're trying to undermine allegiance to these moral codes. There's just no reason to steal something. You say, well, what if my family's starving to death? And the grocery store is full of food. I should let my little kid sit out in the car and starve? No. What should you do if you live in Raymore, the city I live in, and your children don't have food to eat? Does anyone know that there are at least 2 or 3 churches in Raymore that have food pantries that give food to families so their children won't starve to death? Well, I'm not going to ask for charity. I'll just go to Walmart and steal it. Well, see, there, now you've made a choice, but the point is, you're so proud that you won't ask for help. You're going to let your child starve because of your pride? Get over it. Go take some charity from people who want to give food away. There are plenty of people out there doing it. But see, this dilemma is presented with the idea that, and here's the whole thrust of this, I mean, it's been around for years. The whole idea is, see, there are certain circumstances where it would be right to steal something. And I'm just telling you, it's not right to steal something. I mean, does the Bible say, thou shalt not steal unless your children are very hungry? Thou shalt not steal unless you want it so bad you can't afford to pay for it? No, it's just embrace the moral code that says thou shalt not steal. And then just don't steal. I don't know what's so hard about that. Page 297 talks about Kohlberg's levels of moral reasoning. They go from punishment and obedience. Now, this is where some people criticize Kohlberg, because he talks about these stages that they go through, to where they start out at stage 1 is punishment and obedience, and they get up to stage 5, social contracts and individual rights, and then stage 6, universal ethical principles. Okay, when I get in my car to drive home, let's embrace a universal ethical principle. Submit to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. Isn't that a principle from Scripture? So that means when the sign says 35 miles an hour, I should drive my car at 35 miles an hour, because I embrace a universal ethical principle that's given to us by the Creator of the universe. Submit to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. And that's one of man's ordinances. So I'm on my way home, and I've got something I want to do when I get there, and I'm in a hurry and I'm running late. So I'm thinking, maybe if it says 35, it would be okay today if I went 45 to get home a little quicker. Now, what's going to stop me from going 45? My universal ethical principle that I just quoted, or the fact that if I do, the Raymore police will stop me and charge me a $100 fine? Which one's going to cause me to sit the cruise at 35 and take the extra time to get home? Now you say, well, it ought to be the universal principle. I know, but sometimes it's just punishment and obedience. And I don't know about you, but have you ever ridden in the car with somebody where they were speeding and they didn't get a ticket? So you decided to try it on your own, and you got a ticket immediately? I've had people tell me that when they get stopped, they get warnings. I've never had a warning in my life. Anytime I've been speeding and I get stopped, I get a ticket and I have to pay money. Is that God trying to teach me something? You're special, Tom. Remember what you told your girls? You're special. And He's not going to let you get away with that like He does other people. He's going to make you pay. And so, see, basically what's going on is here, we are, maybe we don't realize it often, but we're operating at stage 1 and stage 6 often at the same time. It's just we kind of jump back and forth depending on what the pressure of the day is doing to us. Stage 3 has to do with relationships and interpersonal expectations and conformity. Stage 4 is the social system and your conscience. But in my mind, our conscience kicks in sometimes before we know the universal ethical principle. And sometimes because we've memorized a universal ethical principle, our conscience is adjusted and kicks in. But then sometimes it's like, and if you don't do the right thing, you could be punished. So the critics of Kohlberg say it isn't all just stages that you go through and reach these upper levels. It's kind of like all of us are going to operate at all these levels at different times in life. Okay. Page 298 talks about parenting. What kind of parenting styles and best practices? Bottom of page 299, the research has identified 4 distinct styles of parenting that represent the different combinations of high and low parental warmth combined with high and low parental control. And basically, what's going on here? Parents can be too controlling or not controlling enough, or parents can be too warm or not warm enough. And what does it talk about on page 300? Authoritative parents are warm with firm control. Authoritarian parents have firm control without the warmth, and permissive parents have the warmth without the control. So look what happens. Can you see how a warm, loving parent who exerts firm control is a good balance? And it says, compared to other children, children raised by this kind of parent performs better in school, is less hostile, and is more popular among their friends. They have greater self-esteem. They show more purpose and independence in their activities. And as adolescents, they're more accurate in understanding their parents' values. The firm parents without the warmth, the children become more hostile and aggressive and are less popular with their peers, and are less independent than children reared by the warm, nurturing, controlling parent. And then the permissive parent who thinks, I'm just making this child happy by giving him everything he wants. Whoa, what happens here? Permissive parents avoid confrontation with their children, being too lenient. They don't require their children to behave in a mature and responsible manner. A permissive parent might dismiss misbehavior as, well, you know, that's just the way it is. At the extreme, permissive parents become indulgent. And compared to the other children, children of permissive homes are more impulsive, do less well in school, are less self-assured, are less independent, and are less confident. And in fact, when we get to the other textbook for this class, Dr. Dobson's book, when we start going through his book, he wrote one of his books based on his work in pediatrics in a hospital in California, because he had a lot of parents who were raised by permissive parents who were having children, and they didn't know what to do with their children because they hadn't been taught any kind of discipline and the children were driving them crazy, so they would just overreact and be impulsive and lack control and injure their children, throw them around and hurt them and things, and they would be coming into the hospital and needing help because the parents didn't know how to handle them, because they weren't taught to be parents by their own parents. And if you can believe it, the book he wrote as a result of that was a book called Dare to Discipline. And when he wrote that book, and my wife and I bought a copy of it and started using it with our children, we had some friends who would say, "Why are your kids so well behaved?" And we'd say, "Well, we got this book from James Dobson," and we would share it with them. And friends of ours, Christian friends of ours, would get upset and said, "I'm not going to do stuff like that. That's just wrong." It's like setting boundaries and having discipline for your children was wrong, and it was all because of the culture that they had been raised in and the way they had grown up in a world that had changed so drastically from what it used to be. Do you? See, I talk about my parents traumatizing me over stealing, and I smile about it because it saved me a lot of grief. In fact, after I got saved, I went to my dad and I told him, in fact, he said one time, he said, "Son, you're running around with some pretty rowdy friends." And he said, "You need to know something. If they go to jail, their parents will bail them out." He said, "If you go to jail, don't you dare tell them your last name is Bonine. Don't embarrass the family name. Just don't give them your name and sit there and rot." Those were the exact words he used. And when my friends would do things that could get them arrested, I'd say, "Well, sorry guys, I'm headed a different direction. You've got a safety net I don't have." And they would say, "Oh, your dad wouldn't do that." And I thought, yes, he would. He was so proud of his last name. He wasn't a Christian, but he was proud of his last name, and he would have done that. And when I was in my 20s, a young Christian, and I said to him, "Thank you, Dad, for some of the things that you did to keep me in line when I was younger." And I mentioned that as one time. He said, "Oh," he said, "I wouldn't have done that." Well, see, he said that now that I'm a grown, responsible young man. I'm telling you people, he would have done it. I know he would have. And you say, "And so do you have bad memories of your father?" No, I have good memories because of what it did for me to have those kinds of expectations. Page 302. Oh, I guess we should have talked on page 301 about rejecting and neglecting parents. That is so sad. Why would you have children if you're going to reject them and neglect them? Say, "Well, I didn't know how much grief they would be when I had them." Well, if they're too much grief, can't you give them up for adoption? Can't you? Aren't there plenty of families out there who would love to have a child? "Well, I don't want to give them up. I just don't want them to bother me." Well, sorry, but being a parent takes some sacrifice. Page 302. Look what this says. Spare the rod and spare the child. Were you taught that early in life? Or were you taught spare the rod and spoil the child? One time I was teaching at a family conference up in Nebraska, and there was another Christian who was also teaching there, who was a professor at the University of Nebraska, but she was a Christian. And I was talking about Dobson's Dare to Discipline book and a rod of correction, driving foolishness from the heart of a child. And somebody said to me that this lady from the University of Nebraska says that we shouldn't do that. And I said, "Well, why don't you ask her what she does with that verse?" And then I saw her at lunch, so I sat down and I said, "What do you do with that verse?" And she said, "Well, there's a lot of interpretations as to what a rod is." And I said, "There are?" She says, "Yes, a rod could be time out." Now, there's no question that time out is a good kind of discipline. But when you look in the Bible do a word study on what a rod is, it is not time out. The closest thing I ever had to a biblical rod was my grandmother getting frustrated with my behavior and going to a little weeping willow tree and snipping off a little branch, peeling the leaves off of it, and smacking me on the back of my legs because I was wearing shorts. Have you ever had a little switch slapped across the back of your legs? Well, there's another traumatic experience that'll make a lasting impression. And it gave me a great deal of respect for my grandmother. It's like, whatever you do, don't make her go to the willow tree and get a switch. Those things hurt. And that's the closest thing I ever saw to that rod that the Bible talks about. And it doesn't mean we do it all the time. In fact, if the rod's used properly, it doesn't have to be used very often. But I will say this, that I like what they say about doing some other things with children instead of just spanking them for everything. And what are some of those other things we can do? Should parents have to be licensed? Now that's a good idea, isn't it? You have to get a license to raise children. Page 305 talks about positive discipline. And I like these suggestions. One, page 305, manage the situation. Instead of waiting till somebody's done something that need to be punished for, watch what's going on and control the situation so it doesn't get out of hand in the first place. You reduce the opportunities for misbehavior by managing the situation. I'm watching my grandsons play basketball or play kickball or play football, and all of a sudden one of them gets upset and I'm going, whoa, time out, guys. And they go, what, Poppy? I said, bring me the football. Let's find something else to play with. This is getting just a little too emotional. We're starting to lose control. You know that self-regulation stuff? We'll be okay. I said, no, I don't think so. No more football. Let's play something else. And they start playing basketball, and then they're doing fine, and I'm watching, and I'm saying, whoa, wait a minute. One of them gets upset, and he pushes the other one. Give me the basketball. And have you figured out what happens? If I take away the football and I take away the basketball, because I'm managing the situation when it gets out of hand, these two boys are smart enough to figure out, I mean, they're born 5 days apart, so they're pretty competitive. They're smart enough to figure out that if we don't learn to get along while we're playing, he'll take away all of our toys. Then we won't have anything left to play with. So they start being a little more responsible. So I like that first suggestion on page 305 where it says manage the situation. On page 306, the second one, it said clear rules and limits. And here was my rule. Here were my limits. If we're playing a game and we get upset about it, we stop playing the game. Playing a game should never result in us losing control of our emotions or behaving in unkind ways toward other people. I've often thought you don't need referees to play basketball or soccer. It's just if someone's driving for the basket and you tried to block them but you fouled them, you raise your hand and say, hey, I fouled them, they get a free throw. I mean, why couldn't a person do that? You say, well, because if the referee didn't catch it, you get away with it. No, you don't get away with it. You still feel bad about it. They just didn't get a free throw. But couldn't we change the game to where we could call ourselves for stuff? And then if you say, no, I didn't foul him, I'm saying, let's ask your teammates. Did it look to you like they fouled him? Or we could ask the other 9 people on the court. So let's vote. Say, yeah, Lydia fouled him. Let him go to the free throw line. Lydia goes, well, I don't think I fouled him. And then pretty soon her friend says, get control, Lydia, get control. You fouled him. I mean, wouldn't that be a valuable way to learn to play the game? I suppose we're so competitive, you can't do that. But even with referees out there, I mean, did you guys see the highlight of that helmet hit on that pass receiver? That it wasn't called? That was so tragic and so sad. And the people in New Orleans are all bent out of shape because they missed out on the Super Bowl because of it. So set clear rules and limits. Number 3, praise good behavior. All that means is I say, you know guys, I love the way you're playing ball together. Even if you're not winning, you're still being a good sportsman. So you praise them for good behavior. But you notice the whole time I'm out there watching what's going on. In fact, people inside are saying, where's Tom? How come he's not in here visiting? He said, oh, he's out with the kids. He likes to watch the kids play. Yeah, that's what I do. People think I like to watch the kids play. No, what I'm doing is managing what's going on so it won't get out of control, and so they don't run in the house crying to their mom about somebody did something to them and now somebody has to fix it. And number 4, I like using explanations and reasons, but sometimes I'm going to say, you need to obey just because I told you to do something. I used to take our little girls in this 3 to 6 age and I say, girls, I'm not sure that you're buying into this obedience thing like you ought to be. God tells you to honor and obey your parents. So I'm going to play a little game here called the obedience game. So I said, just go ahead and play with your toys, and they're playing, and then I would call one of them by name, and I'd say, Linda. She'd say, what, Dad? I said, go in the kitchen and get a fork out of the silverware drawer and bring it to me, please. And she would go get it and bring it to me, and I'd say, thank you very much. Now, see, she'd be tempted to say, why do you want a fork, Dad? I said, that doesn't matter. Just be obedient. Just go to the kitchen, get a fork, and bring it to me. And so she brings it to me, and I say, thank you very much. You can go back and play. Then I call her sister, Karen. I said, Karen, this fork, I don't need it anymore. Go put it in the kitchen back in the drawer. Now, can you see she's, well, why do I have to take it back? My sister's the one who got it. Hey, I don't want to hear that. I just want to see obedience. You understand? I was trying to help them learn that there's a principle that when you're told to do something, just do it. Don't argue about it. But I still like the idea of explaining and giving reasons for things, but not to the point to where they never learn to obey. And then number 5, if you must punish, and you will sometime, then remove privileges, take away privileges, use time out. If they're fighting over a toy, take the toy away. Sometimes you can actually have them sit down and write notes about what does God say about this, and how should I behave about this if they're old enough to write. If they're not, maybe you should just have them sit in the chair while you have a talk with them. This little boy needs some talking because he's not a happy little camper. Page 314. Socio-dramatic play. Well, page 308, clear up till the end of the chapter, talks about play. Just remember, these kids are playing all the time. They're playing all the time, and it would be healthy for us to manage the play that they're doing. But when you get up to page 3.14, it talks about how they imitate adults, how they reenact family relationships, how they express needs. Watching a little girl paddle a doll is really interesting when you see how they've reacted to you paddling them. Outlet for forbidden impulses. Now, I'm not so sure I like that one. Reversal of roles. And then cultural differences in play. Different cultures have different ways of handling play, and you probably ought to become culturally aware when you're working with a culture. But just remember, God designed children to be active and to play and to do things. And if they're going to grow and become all that God wants them to be, we need to help them develop their play skills, because play skills are going to eventually turn into life skills. All right, that's enough of this. I'll turn this off and we'll do chapter 10 on Monday.